And now we will meet Michael Keller, who is an investigative reporter at New York Times. And they launched a news story, extensive one, in February on sexual child abuse, child sexual abuse. And the headline, or the beginning, was like this, I quote, 20 years ago, the online images were a problem. 10 years ago, an epidemic. Now the crisis is at a breaking point. What went wrong? So, Michael, welcome to our seminar. There you are.
Thank you for having me.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm beginning. I'm quoting the beginning of this extensive story. How were the reactions when you published it?
They were quite interesting. The reactions from readers were mostly that the topic was incredibly disturbing, which I think was what we wanted to portray accurately. I think coming into this field and reading some of how it's often discussed or people think about it, there were a lot of euphemisms. People don't quite understand the level of horribleness that happens and what is depicted. I think, language like, was sexually assaulted or abused doesn't quite get at some of what investigators and people that are trying to solve this problem really see every day. One thing that was particularly shocking to me was we heard when we were talking with the FBI that while they investigate every tip that comes in where it seems like a child could be in imminent danger, they do have to do a certain level of triage from some of the tips they get from the National Center. And they really prioritize the ones where the abuse involves infants and toddlers, which really just was beyond shocking to me that was not only that type of abuse was happening, but that it was happening in such a large volume. So we got a lot of reactions from readers that this was something they didn't know about. They didn't know about the extent of it, which, as a journalist, certainly you try and educate people about new things. In the legislative world, there have been some reactions to it. There were so far about 3 proposals in the US to try and solve some of the problems, some of which we identified, including increasing the amount of time that technology companies are required to hold on to the material that they find. We found that sometimes by the time law enforcement gets notified, they go back to the company to try and get more information and they say, well, we don't have it anymore. So a proposal would double that period from 90 to 180 days. There have been some more controversial proposals to limit the immunity that technology companies currently have over certain types of user-generated content. In this case, child exploitation content, and other proposals to dramatically increase the funding that US law enforcement would get to try and look into this. One of the issues that we found was that while Congress is authorized to spend a certain amount of money every year to dedicated law enforcement groups looking at this crime, that funding has really been stagnant over the last 10 years. And as you pointed out, how we introduced our first article, the problem has really increased dramatically.
That's one of your findings. We'll come back to your main findings. But first, what sparked your interest? How did you start this entire very extensive journalistic job?
Yeah, it started all from an anonymous tip. Tipster wrote into us saying that they were searching on Microsoft's Bing search engine for a very specific weight of bullet. And instead of getting images of bullets, they were getting back explicit images of children, which to them was, I think to anyone would be extremely disturbing. So because I work on the investigations team at the New York Times looking at technology issues, this tip came to me. We followed kind of the keywords that the tipster wrote in saying they used. And sure enough, we didn't get back bullets, but images of children and also suggested terms that the search engine returned to us that also had nothing to do with bullets.
And this was a very respectable and normal search engine. It was Microsoft's, right?
Right. And I think what's surprising when you come across something like this is you hear stories of people, who download a movie on BitTorrent and the next day they get their internet service shut off. And so the question for us was, well, how does something like this just appear on the open web? And I think you read stories about, well, this is on the dark web. This was just so easily accessible that it really made us wonder, well, how is this possible? One tricky thing as journalists is that in the United States, there's no legal protection or safe harbor for viewing these images, or any do-gooder that wants to go out and try and find it and report it. So we contacted our lawyer who told us that, and then immediately forwarded the tip to the FBI and got in touch with them. But it really started us down this road of, well, this is very strange and very disturbing. How do we look into this more? And one of the first things we learned was just that the numbers had really dramatically increased over the last 10 years.
But
And it just led to this question of, well, how did we get here?
But FBI didn't want you to, or actually told you that it could be a crime for you to continue the investigation. Did you get my question?
The last part dropped off, but I think it was probably how did we then investigate
I
that?
think that FBI advised you not to continue the investigation because you could then be treated as a criminal.
Yeah, so they didn't use those words exactly. I mean, I think they just said, we remind you that you don't have any legal protections if you view these images. But it did make us think really hard about, okay, this seems like a really important story. How do we go about it in a way that's both, I mean, not just legal, but also ethical? Because I think one of the big issues that we heard is that just viewing the images is an act of re-victimization, and we didn't want to provide any harm in, even with good intentions. So we learned about Microsoft's PhotoDNA. We also learned that they allow you to sign up for that service. So we filled out an application, said we were the New York Times and journalists. And I think about a month and a half later, we got approved. And that opened up some interesting possibilities for us. So because I work on the technology investigations team, I have a bit of a background in computer programming. So I was able to write a computer script that would essentially replicate what the tipster did, kind of search the internet on, both on Bing and other search engines with those keyword terms. But very importantly, the script wouldn't show any type of graphical interface. And also it would block any requests for image data. So not only would we not be seeing anything that was happening on kind of a computer level, there was actually no image data even coming to our servers. So we felt that was kind of an ethical and legal balance, or did it in a good way. And so what we were able to do then is, even though there are no actual images, you could still get the URL that appeared on the search result page. We then took that URL and sent it to Microsoft's PhotoDNA service, and searching on Bing and others, we actually found matches, which was very surprising to us. We had this kind of fundamental question at the heart of the reporting, which is, what the tipster saw, was that actually illegal? Certainly there's different definitions. Not every picture of a naked child is illegal. And so it confirmed that, yes, there were actually illegal images on the open web, and a surprising finding that even using Microsoft's own PhotoDNA service on their own search engine, it found matches. We contacted Microsoft and they said that it was a bug and a mistake and that they'd fixed it. One technique that we often employ as investigative journalists is you do it again.
And again,
and we found
and again,
more after that.
Yeah.
And so it did seem like there were, and it wasn't just Microsoft. I think there were, we started reading court cases and found that this was a problem across many different platforms. You have offenders who would go on to Facebook groups and ask people, how can I start getting these images? And they say, well, you should download Kick Messenger to start talking to kids, and then download Dropbox, and that's how you can start sharing them. And so we found that there was definitely pervasive across the industry. And I can talk about this a little bit more, but the tools that existed, like PhotoDNA, didn't seem to be fully implemented to the degree that we would have expected.
Okay. So your main findings then, if you try to conclude them, because there were quite a few. One main
Yeah,
finding,
we
if we start, Michael, if we start with the main finding in the institutions, in the police force, FBI, and the Justice Department, that part, what did you find there?
yeah, we found that about 10 years ago, the government and law enforcement knew that this was a growing problem, that there was one law enforcement officer who testified before Congress who said at the time, this was around 2007, 2008, that they were underfunded, overwhelmed, and drowning in a tidal wave of tragedy. And this was a person who was monitoring peer-to-peer networks. They could see possible offenders trading this material, but they didn't have the resources to go after them. Congress did react. They passed a bill, a landmark bill at the time, that did essentially three main things. It authorized a certain level of funding that the Congress could spend each year. Two, it required the Justice Department to really study the problem and issue new strategy reports every 2 years. And three, it put someone in charge of all of that at the Justice Department. And our reporting found that none of these three really lived up to what the lawmakers had expected. While there is a certain level of funding that gets approved each year, it's been pretty flat for the last 10 years and has not really kept pace with the scope of the problem, which has really grown exponentially. Two, the Justice Department, those reports they were supposed to put out every 2 years, there's only been 2 done so far. The last one was in 2016, and we did kind of a close reading of it, and it was missing many of the kind of key provisions that were required to be included by law. And third, the person in charge of the whole national response, that position does exist, but it's never been really given the full authority that it was supposed to. And so when you don't have a good understanding of the scope and the strategy, and you don't have someone really vested with enough power to really raise those alarm bells, a lot of people told us that's how you get into the position that we're in, where the problem now 10 years later has grown even bigger, and we still don't have a great handle on how to solve it.
How come?
On the
How come that it's
one
possible
per
that it's what do you think is the explanation?
we spoke with the first person that held that national coordinator position, and she told us that it just was never a priority among the top officials at the Justice Department, that other issues like terrorism often took the spotlight. In our reporting, we found that there's a very advanced cybercrime center at Homeland Security Investigations. But part of their funding, a good chunk of their funding was withheld until the last month of the fiscal year after we started asking questions about it, and it was diverted to immigration enforcement. So it seemed like there was a pattern where just other law enforcement priorities took precedence.
You have other main findings. Could you tell us about one more?
Yeah, so on the technology side, I mentioned how it seemed like photo DNA wasn't fully implemented in terms of the search engines. We found that other kind of policy questions like when images are scanned was inconsistent across different technology companies. For instance, on many file sharing platforms, the files were only scanned once a file was shared, which certainly isn't very comprehensive, and so would lead to court cases that we would read where law enforcement would get a tip about 2 images, they would go in with a search warrant and then find thousands or tens of thousands more, and that had been shared over the course of years. So it was really, we were just having very little visibility in some sense into what was actually on the networks. Video, I think, was also one of the big takeaways that we found, that while there is a standard for images, there really isn't a standard format for video. Photo DNA for video exists, but different companies use different ones, and kind of limits how much you can share. And what one company finds may not then be findable by another one because there isn't kind of a shared resource or shared language. And people said that was a hindrance. And other companies such as Amazon Web Services or other kind of enterprise cloud platforms, don't scan at all. So that was certainly, there are just big blind spots in the industry.
Michael, this might be a personal question, but how have your view of society changed after this investigation you did?
That's a good question. I think it certainly was much darker than we ever thought it would be. But I think we also met a lot of people who have dedicated their lives to this topic. We spent about a year on this investigation. We spoke with people in law enforcement, child advocates, and certainly we spoke with victims and survivors themselves who are dealing with this personally, but also trying to help other people. So that was also extremely positive, that you have people that, despite how horrific it is, have, said, this is what I want to do with my life and try and make the world better. So that was also a good counterbalance.
And finally, then, when you presented this idea to the editors of New York Times, were you welcomed, or were they kind of hesitant? It's too complicated, it's too nasty, people don't want to read about it?
No, I think that was really what was amazing, is we had a very high level of support all the way to the top, and that they recognized that this was a hugely important story that wasn't being told. And I think we did 4 Sunday front page stories about it, which certainly in this news climate is hard to do. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of important things going on in the world. It was really a whole team that also was dedicated to, how do we not just tell the story and get the facts out, but tell it in a way that really engages people and explains it, tells it emotionally. And we were fortunate to have parents of children that had been abused, as well as 2 women who were abused as children, who were agreed to be photographed. And I think telling it with that human side, even though it is something that is illegal, to show the abuse itself, and but being able to find ways to humanize it, I think really was key for us, and hopefully that came across. I think from readers' reactions, that was one of their takeaways.
Michael, you really, you succeeded. This story has made it all its way through all the way to Sweden, to Stockholm, and we pick it up and we interview you, and we are happy to do so. Thank you so much for participating in this event.
Oh, thank you for having me.